So these two men are different in the sense, and this particular theorization you'll find right in the next paragraph, and maybe I can quote from the text as well. So when we come down upon these same lines, probably you can think back and take up Alexander Pope versus Wordsworth example. So where are these two men different? These two men are different, and I quote from the text on the same page number, that is on page number 4, the next paragraph. So I'm taking a pause so that you all be ready with your text on page number 4. That is on the same page that we were on when we were discussing about good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Exactly right after this paragraph, we move on to the smaller next paragraph. And I take up this line. It has been said that each of these poems has a purpose. Another circumstance must be mentioned which distinguishes these poems from the popular poetry of the day. And this is, and I quote once again, with underlined, bold, or italicized, I would have been, if we would have been teaching in the classroom, this would have been the situation, that the feelings therein developed gives importance to the action and situation, and not the action and situation to the feeling. Let me repeat. The feeling therein developed gives importance to action and situation, and not the otherwise. And that otherwise is the action and situation are not utmost important, which give rise to certain feeling. Rather, it is the feeling which is most important, and that something makes sense to, or that something makes sense of that particular action and situation. This is where the difference is of, say, between Wordsworth and Alexander Pope. Alexander Pope, and if you recall, even Aristotle, both of them somewhere gave utmost importance to action or situation, right? So feeling was always secondary. Feeling was, in fact, tertiary for them. Not secondary, even tertiary, had no importance. So when Alexander Pope, even if after some years, decided to sit back and write about this incident of cutting of the lock, and look at the way it is being named, the rape of the lock, you are talking about a particular action that happened at a particular situation at a particular time, right? So you are clearly laying emphasis on the action, on the situation outside. Had Alexander Pope, now listen to this very carefully. This is a very hypothetical situation and an exaggerated hypothetical situation, but I'm trying to draw your attention to the concept behind it. Had Mr. Alexander Pope been writing during the Romantic times, he would have never focused on the lock getting cut off or the lock getting chopped off from Arabella Farmer's hair. Rather, his poetic subject would be Arabella Farmer's feelings when this thing happened, this incident happened. I hope you're trying to get it, and it's a very simple concept as well. Neoclassicism was a time which clearly laid and followed by certain poetic techniques. They were laying emphasis on the outside events and what relevance these events, these situations, these actions had, or what relevance or impact these situations, events and actions had on certain individuals, and the poetry about it. And Wordsworth or the Romantic poets, they say that feelings developed give importance to action and situation, and not the other way around. So what Wordsworth says is, it is the poet should just have a body of rules or a body of techniques to follow, but he has the entire universe of things to explore, to draw upon his poetic subject, right? And this is where they both were different. A simple example, another example. We all are in a particular situation where COVID-19, we all are experiencing this lockdown situation. Now, this is something, the truth of the matter, that everyone else is going through as well. That is the external things, right? So if someone decides to write down a poetic piece on it, if they are not romantic, if they are not following what Mr. Wordsworth poetry aesthetic theory says, if they are not following it, then of course they'll focus upon the external situation, they'll focus upon the external actions. But if someone whom you call a romantic if someone whom you call, who follows or who has at least some idea, or someone who has some acquaintance with Wordsworth's aesthetic poetry, then they will think about, or they'll write down the feelings that occurred when this entire situation was going on of COVID-19, so and so forth, right? So this is where both these poets are different. And I also took the name of Aristotle. Why I mentioned his name? Because even Aristotle, in his tragedies and in his poetry, he laid emphasis on action, plot, action, situations, and how they are structured together, whether or not they are structured well, connected well or not, whether or not they are interdependent, independent or not, right? So these things we have already discussed in class. But this is where now the tables have turned. Here it's more like the subversion of things or subversion of concepts that you'll read. Earlier, those who were laying emphasis, those earlier age critics, when they were emphasizing upon the action part, the external things, external situations, and that is why plot and story, so on and so forth. Here was a man, even in poetry then, remember epic poetry, here was a man who was, that's why he's even called an iconoclast. He was a man who was rebelling against this very nature of poetic composition. And he says it is feeling which develops at a particular action or situation, which gives importance to these actions and situations, and which is even true. These actions outside and situations outside, or the incidents outside, have no relevance in themselves unless we human beings attach certain degree of feelings of good, bad, okay, or whatever it is to them. They are null and void. They don't exist in themselves. We give them, or we attach certain grouping of feeling to them, right? Only then they become important. So if we find that we are feeling terrible in this COVID-19 lockdown situation, and this is what we have lost all our joy, and we are just filled with sorrow and despair and huge amount of, or huge degrees of depression, then of course COVID-19 situation or the lockdown situation becomes terrible for you, right? But if on the other hand you take it positively and you see it as some sort of blessing in disguise, and you think about all the joy and enthusiasm that you get when you're sitting with your family and you're being with your family 24/7, if it generates joy, then the same situation outside becomes a moment of joy for you, right? So this is where both these poets were different. That amid my past mood and past experiences, which feelings I have to take up? Of course, so the idea is the poet, when they're trying to contemplate it in past, when the poet is in meditative recollection, is trying to take out a feeling, or is trying to rummage through that particular feeling, which is summoned from the past, which is called up from the past, and using that contemplating mind as well as the sensibility that now got created, the union of these two, bringing these two together harmoniously, gives rise to the feeling of another sensation, another unique mood, another unique feeling, and that unique feeling is what forms the content of that poetic piece. So the emotion that rises not from the direct experience of that object, the emotion that rises not from the immediate confrontation of the object, but, or rather, from a contemplation at a distance, from an object conceived, or a feeling, or when a feeling is recalled, right? And if you remember, I said earlier too that poetry is born in contemplation, in the meditative recollection of a feeling taken from the past. This is what exactly I meant. That is, poetry doesn't, as per Mr. Wordsworth, poetry should not be formed, or it should not be composed with some direct experience of the object or immediate confrontation of it. Rather, the emotion that rises from that contemplation after some time, at a distance, or when that particular feeling is recalled, only then the content of poetry is formed. Now you can raise a question here. Ma'am, does it mean that when Alexander Pope, when he sat down and thought about thought about composing few lines on Arabella Farmer of Rape of the Lock, he was also indulging in exactly this kind of activity. His emotion were not the experience of the direct. His emotions did not rise from the direct experience. He did not had any, say, immediate confrontation. Rather, he maybe after a month or 2 months or 6 months, a year or few years, he sat down and he contemplated at a distance, right? Or he recalled that particular feeling. Then how is he different from Mr. Wordsworth? After all, both of them have involved themselves into a similar activity. Then how come both of them are different on the external actions? But if someone whom you call a romantic, if someone whom you call who follows or who has at least some idea, or someone who has some acquaintance with Wordsworth's aesthetic poetry, then they will think about, or they'll write down the feelings that occurred when this entire situation was going on of COVID-19, so and so forth, right? So this is where both these poets are different. And I also took the name of Aristotle. Why I mentioned his name? Because even Aristotle, in his tragedies and in his poetry, he laid emphasis on action, plot, action, situations, and how they are structured together, whether or not they are structured well, connected well or not, whether or not they are interdependent, independent or not, right? So these things we have already discussed in class. But this is where now the tables have turned. Here it's more like the subversion of things subversion of concepts that you'll read. Earlier, those who were laying emphasis, those earlier age critics, when they were emphasizing upon the action part, the external things, external situations, and that is why plot and story, so on and so forth. Here was a man, even in poetry then, remember, epic poetry, here was a man who was, that's why he's even called an iconoclast. Here was a man who was rebelling against this very nature of poetic composition. And he says it is feeling which develops at a particular action or situation, which gives importance to these actions and situations, and which is even true. These actions outside and situations outside, or the incidents outside, have no relevance in themselves unless we human beings attach certain degree of feelings of good, bad, okay, or whatever it is to them. They are null and void. They don't exist in themselves. We give them, or we attach certain grouping of feeling to them, right? Only then they become important. So if we find that we are feeling terrible in this COVID-19 lockdown situation, and this is what we have lost all our joy, and we are just filled with sorrow and despair and huge amount of, or huge degrees of depression, then of course COVID-19 situation or the lockdown situation becomes terrible for you, right? But if on the other hand you take it positively and you see it as some sort of blessing in disguise, and you think about all the joy and enthusiasm that you get when you're sitting with your family and you're being with your family 24/7, if it generates joy, then the same situation outside becomes a moment of joy for you, right? So this is where both these poets were different. So before we begin with the reading of this text, that is continuing from where we left last, after For All Good Poetry is the Spontaneous Overflow, I hope this is clear that when a poet recreates a past mood, when he goes back into the past experience, into the past of his mind, or contemplation through mind's contemplation, he actually churns out all the old sensations that he felt at that moment, or amid these sensations, amid these feelings. The poet is supposed to rummage, the poet is supposed to ferret out, to literally ransack among the lot of feelings that exist, and with the use of thought, with the use of so-called mind, which is the part of the brain, with the use of that mind, he has to explore which is the right expression, and then that right expression has to be chosen. So basically, amid those a plethora of feelings, the mind has to rummage through those feelings and ultimately come up with the right expression, right? So this right expression is chosen judiciously, not out of feelings, emotions, someone's whims and fancies. It comes very wisely, very judiciously. It is selected, and this is selected by the principle, by the something called the principle of selection. So what's this principle of selection is? Let's first make an attempt to understand, and this understanding initially I'm providing you so that once we start with the reading of this remaining part of the paragraph, it will be clear once you have the foundation or the bottom line of, or the crux of what exactly is he trying to say in this paragraph, right? After especially that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, right? So after rummaging through these best of the feelings, or that recalling sensation, that moment of recalling, and all those old sensations coming through mind, and with the use of that contemplating mind, the mind takes out the best possible feelings with the principle of selection. And this principle of selection is based on the fact that whatever is really important to men, whatever is most crucial to the larger humanity and its benefit, only those general representative feelings would be selected. So this selection of feelings is very much judiciously done by the mind. So if you pay close attention, you'll realize that three things are continuously at interplay. One is mind, as if mind has a life of its own, as if mind has got some soul, some animated power of its own. The fact that mind is making certain selections, the mind is making certain judicious choices, right? So it is as if the mind in itself has a life of its own, which is somewhere even said, repeated by some of the famous philosophers as well in the 18th and 19th century. The mind indeed has a life of its own. Second is the role of feelings. Again, these feelings are nothing but the expression that is generated from the heart when anybody, say XYZ, views a particular object. That could be any object. That could, for that matter, be a particular toddler, or a toddler playing, or a toddler trying to speak up something. So all these cute little things that you find appealing, that may appeal to your five senses, your feelings get generated. And third thing here is passion. So what Wordsworth is trying to say, once these emotions are recollected, when the mind is contemplating, and it is contemplating to bring about nearly the same sensations that it felt initially when the person experienced that particular object in the first place. So after that judicious selection of, okay, this is the group of best feelings, or this is how the description should be, that chosen words, or that those feelings, when they are best taken out, that is very much judiciously, very much sagaciously by the mind. Once it is done, then this principle of selection works. Mind select judiciously only those feelings which are commonly catering to the larger benefit of humanity. And when the mind keeps on, or makes it the part of its habit to select judiciously only those particular feelings which are going to be relevant for the larger concern of the humanity, then once it becomes a habit of the mind by repetition or by continuation of this act, then the feelings finally are connected with the most important subjects. Now, here there's a catch. Don't you think that there is some sort of a direct attack on all those neoclassical poets that have laid emphasis on, or that have selected their poetic subject something of a very trivial in nature? For example, Rape of the Lock. Isn't it a direct attack on Alexander Pope's selection of this subject as well? That what about the mind of this man who has not been so judicious in his selection of the right poetic subject, and what all he's talking of is nothing but a woman, a particular lock of a woman, and how it was being, say, ripped off from the skull, and how because of someone's ego war, or because of a group of families that were involved, or because of the ego war between these families, how this entire thing becomes a poetic subject. This is so trivial in nature in itself. How can triviality enter the poetic subjects in the first place? How can such levels of triviality or such levels of futility enter or become the part of poetic aesthetics? That was something that was a big question mark on the part of Mr. Wordsworth. And this is the reason he particularly says that only those subjects are taken up, only those general representative feelings are taken up that are really important to men. And this mind, by its continuation of this act of judiciously selecting up those feelings only which are important for the larger humanity, these feelings can understand what important subjects under earth exist, right?